Hello! Yay, there's people here. That's exciting. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Isolation Literary Society presents... the Isolated Literary Society. I just made up the name like 2 hours ago, so give me a break. Presents Daily Austen with Sarah Shay. That's me. I have been doing daily readings of Pride and Prejudice for the last... mostly just on Instagram. And I finally finished the book and decided I'd like to keep doing it because it's been really fun. So starting with today, we will be reading, I'm setting up my tablet to go on Instagram as well. We'll be reading Emma. Let's go live on Instagram. Okay, now to repeat, welcome to the Isolated Literary Society presents Daily Austen with Sarah Shay. Today is the first day reading Emma. Oh boy, Instagram's getting a real fun angle. Oh, Instagram gets to see the whole cat though, so that's a bonus. YouTube only gets some of the cat. So, I'll be reading a few chapters of Emma every day, depending on how I feel. And hi, Strangely. You know, this is on YouTube as well now, just so you know, youtube.com/sarahshay. So you can come over. You can come over here from this device to this device if you want. But you do get to see more Pepper on Instagram, so just so you know. Okay, so let's get started. Oh, shoot, I forgot to start recording. I'm recording this. I'm going to record this on GarageBand as well, so I can record the audio. I forgot to hit record. So I'm sorry, I'm going to say it a third time. Welcome to the Isolated Literary Society presents Daily Austen with Sarah Shay. Today will be our first day reading Emma. We'll be reading a few chapters a day. The cat has decided to leave his perch. I'm sorry you don't all get to watch him for the rest of the thing. We are on YouTube and Instagram, and I will be reading a few chapters every day. Except Sundays when I do a live stream concert. So, today is the first day of Emma. Let us begin with chapter 1. Emma Woodhouse, handsome, clever, and rich, with a comfortable home and happy disposition, seemed to unite some of the best blessings of existence, and had lived nearly 21 years in the world with very little to distress or vex her. She was the youngest of the 2 daughters of a most affectionate, indulgent father, and had, in consequence of her sister's marriage, been mistress of his house from a very early period. Her mother had died too long ago for her to have more than an indistinct remembrance of her caresses, and her place had been supplied by an excellent woman as governess, who had fallen little short of a mother in affection. 16 years had Miss Taylor been in Mr. Woodhouse's family, less as a governess than a friend, very fond of both daughters, but particularly of Emma. Between them, it was more the intimacy of sisters. Wow. My timer reminding me to start the stream got snoozed instead of dismissed. So sorry to everyone. Off to a classy start. Now, where was I? Between them, it was more the intimacy of sisters. Even before Miss Taylor had ceased to hold the nominal office of governess, the mildness of her temper had hardly allowed her to impose any restraint, and the shadow of authority being now long passed away, they had been living together as a friend and friend, very mutually attached, and Emma doing just what she liked, highly esteeming Miss Taylor's judgment, but directed chiefly by her own. The real evils, indeed, of Emma's situation were the power of having rather too much her own way, and a disposition to think a little too well of herself. These were the disadvantages which threatened alloy to her many enjoyments. The danger, however, was at present so unperceived that they did not by any means rank as misfortunes with her. Sorrow came, a gentle sorrow, but not at all in the shape of any disagreeable consciousness. Miss Taylor married. It was Miss Taylor's loss which first brought grief. It was on the wedding day of this beloved friend that Emma first sat in mournful thought of any continuance. The wedding over, and the bride people gone, her father and herself were left to dine together, with no prospect of a third to cheer a long evening. Her father composed himself to sleep after dinner, as usual, and she had then only to sit and think of what she had lost. So tragic. Poor little rich girl. The event had every promise of happiness for her friend. Mr. Weston was a man of unexceptionable character, easy fortune, suitable age, and pleasant manners, and there was some satisfaction in considering with what self-denying, generous friendship she had always wished and promoted the match, but it was a black morning's work for her. The want of Miss Taylor would be felt every hour of every day. She recalled her past kindness, the affection of 16 years, how she had taught and how she had played with her from 5 years old, how she had devoted all her powers to attach and amuse her in health, and how nursed her through the various illnesses of childhood. A large debt of gratitude was owing here, but the intercourse of the last 7 years, the equal footing and perfect unreserve which had followed Isabel's marriage on their being left to each other, was yet a dearer, tenderer recollection. She had been a friend and companion such as few possessed, intelligent, well-informed, useful, gentle, knowing all the ways of the family, interested in all its concerns, and peculiarly interested in herself, in every pleasure, every scheme of hers, one to whom she could speak every thought as it arose, and one who had such affection for her as could never find fault. How was she to bear the change? It was true that her friend was going only half a mile from them, but Emma was aware that great must be the difference between a Mrs. Weston only half a mile from them and a Miss Taylor in the house. That is a good point.
That's true.
I may occasionally make comments, and you may hear off-screen comments from my roommate Carolyn.
I'll try to keep it to a minimum.
Probably we won't have as many comments to make as we did on Pride and Prejudice because we don't know this one as well. So.
Right. I've seen several adaptations, but I've never read it.
I just saw the new Autumn de Wilde version, movie rather, and it was great. We were talking about watching it before we started this, but we can watch it at some point in the middle or afterward.
Yes.
Excuse me. Good heavens! Oh, hello, Teresa.
Yay!
Mm-hmm. Between a Mrs. Weston, only half a mile from them, and a Miss Taylor in the house. And with all her advantages, natural and domestic, she was now in great danger of suffering from intellectual solitude. She dearly loved her father, but he was no companion for her. He could not meet her in conversation, rational or playful. The evil of the actual disparity in their ages, and Mr. Woodhouse had not married early, was much increased by his constitution and habits. For having been of valedutarian? Valedudinarian? Wow, I have no idea what that word means or how to say it. All his life, he's been one of those all his life, whatever it is. Without activity of mind or body, he was a much older man in ways than in years. And though everywhere beloved... This is a great day for me to have a frog in my throat. And though everywhere beloved for the friendliness of his heart and his amiable temper, his talents could not have recommended him at any time. Her sister, though comparatively but little removed by matrimony, being settled in London, only 16 miles off, was much beyond her daily reach, and many a long October and November evening must be struggled through at Hartfield. Before Christmas brought the next visit from Isabella and her husband and their little children to fill the house and give her pleasant society again.
Do you want to know what it means?
Oh, yes, please do.
Valedictorian. It means a person who is unduly anxious about their health. Apparently hypochondriac was not a word back then.
Yes. Okay, I mean, it's a fancy word for hypochondriac. Fancy, old-timey word for hypochondriac.
The example
that math checks out.
The example given in how to use it in a sentence is describing the valedictorian English. So apparently it's something they're known for.
Take it. Well, that math checks out with the depiction of him, particularly in the new movie.
Yes, he is quite the hypochondriac.
All right. Yes, we just okay. Her husband and their little children to fill the house and give her pleasant society again. Highbury, the large and populous village, almost amounting to a town, to which Hartfield, in spite of its separate lawn and shrubberies and name, did really belong, afforded her no equals. The Woodhouses were first in consequence there. All looked up to them. She had many acquaintances in the place, for her father was universally civil, but not one among them who could be accepted in lieu of Miss Taylor for even half a day. It was a melancholy change, and Emma could not but sigh over it and wish for impossible things till her father awoke and made it necessary to be cheerful. His spirits required support. He was a nervous man, easily depressed, fond of everybody that he was used to and hating to part with them, hating change of every kind. Matrimony, as the origin of change, was always disagreeable, and he was by no means yet reconciled to his own daughter's marrying, nor could ever speak of her but with compassion, though it had been entirely a match of affection when he was now obliged to part with Miss Taylor too. And from his habits of gentle selfishness, and of being never able to suppose that other people could feel differently from himself, he was very much disposed to think Miss Taylor had done as sad a thing for herself as for them, and would have been a great deal happier if she had spent all the rest of her life at Hartfield. Emma smiled and chatted as cheerfully as she could to keep him from such thoughts, but when tea came, it was impossible for him not to say exactly what he had said at dinner. Poor Miss Taylor! I wish she were here again. What a pity it is that Mr. Weston never thought of her. I cannot agree with you, Papa. You know I cannot. Mr. Weston is such a good-humored, pleasant, excellent man that he thoroughly deserves a good wife. Then you would not have had Miss Taylor live with us forever and bear all my odd humors when she might have a house of her own. A house of her own? But where is the advantage of a house of her own? This is 3 times as large, and you have never any odd humors, my dear. Yeah, why would you want a house of your own if you could live in somebody else's house that was bigger? I got nothing. How often we shall be going to see them, and they coming to see us. We shall be always meeting. We must begin. We must go and pay our wedding visit very soon. My dear, how am I to get so far? Randalls is such a distance. I could not walk half so far. No, Papa, nobody thought of your walking. We must go in the carriage, to be sure. The carriage? But James will not like to put the horses to for such a short way. And where are the poor horses to be while we are paying our visit? They are to be put in Mr. Weston's stable, Papa. You know we have settled all that already. We talked it all over with Mr. Weston last night. And as for James, you may be very sure he will always like going to Randalls because of his daughter's being housemaid there. I only doubt whether he will ever take us anywhere else. That was your doing, Papa. You got Hannah that good place. Nobody thought of Hannah till you mentioned her. James is so obliged to you. I am very glad I did think of her. I was very lucky, for I would not have had poor James think himself slighted on any account, and I am sure she will make a very good servant. She is a civil, pretty-spoken girl, and I have a great opinion of her. Whenever I see her, she always curtsies and asks me how I do in a very pretty manner, and when you have had her here to do needlework, I observe she always turns the lock of the door the right way and never bangs it. Very specific compliment. I am sure
what
she
you look for.
Right. Yeah. I am sure she will be an excellent servant, and it will be a great comfort to poor Miss Taylor to have somebody about her that she is used to see. Whenever James goes over to see his daughter, you know, she will be hearing of us. He will be able to tell her how we all are. And as you know, if you've seen an adaptation of at least any Austen thing and probably any Regency thing, asking after people's health, extremely important. Yes. I actually saw someone recently say, like, me starting previous emails. Hey, how's it going? What's up? Etc. And that was like me starting emails now. And it's a screen cap of Colin Firth as Mr. Darcy saying, and your family are in good health.
I mean, it was a valid question.
Yeah. And so it is today.
Yes.
Emma spared no exertions to maintain this happier flow of ideas, and hoped, by the help of backgammon, to get her father tolerably through the evening, and be attacked by no regrets but her own. The backgammon table was placed, but a visitor immediately afterwards walked in, and made it unnecessary. Mr. Knightley, a sensible man about 7 or 8 and 30. Oh, Lord! What?
Wow.
Oh!
I did not realize he was that much older.
Wow. Yeah. This is my first time reading this book, if you missed that part. I've seen several adaptations. Wow.
He's like almost twice her age then.
I don't like this book anymore. Yeah, she's 20. Ew. No, thank you. That seems like even a bit of a gap for the time period. I mean, not an uncommon gap, but like,
yeah,
maybe not the norm.
Certainly not Jane Austen's
Surely.
norm.
Not Jane Austen's norm. No, she likes an 8-year gap.
Perfect
Northanger Abbey, Pride and
Perfect 8-year
Prejudice.
gap.
Exactly 8 years.
Yes.
Perfect gap.
Ideal.
I was fully accepting 7 or 8 and 20. I was expecting 7, 8, and 20, and then 30. I was like, is that a typo? All right, y'all, I need you. My sister just said lol in the chat. I need everyone to just go with me and Carolyn on a journey we're about to go on. Let us pretend that she said 7 or 8 and 30, and that she does not mention his age again. And we shall all imagine either Jeremy Northam or Johnny Flynn, according to taste. All right?
Or Johnny Lee Miller.
Or Johnny Lee Miller. Yep, I haven't seen that version yet, so I forgot. Yes, or Johnny Lee Miller.
Definitely makes him look pretty
I don't know. Colin Firth, if you're, whatever you want. Whatever you want. Whatever makes you happy. Picture the Mr. Knightley of your dreams.
Paul Rudd.
I mean, I'd be fine with him being 7 or 8 and 30, but I'm 7 or 8 and 30.
Right, yeah, exactly.
Okay.
It's all right.
We're getting back to the book. That was distressing. I did not expect that. I didn't know it was coming.
We had to process.
Yeah, hopefully there are no more upsetting revelations in this book. Headcanon. Mr. Knightley is in fact 7 or 8 and 20. Done. Mr. Knightley, a sensible man of about 7 or 8 and 20, was not only a very old and intimate friend of the family, but particularly connected with it as the elder brother of Isabella's husband.
Ooh.
He lived about a mile from Highbury, was a frequent visitor, and always welcome, and at this time more welcome than usual, as coming directly from their mutual connections in London. He had returned to a late dinner after some days' absence, and now walked up to Hartfield to say they were all well in Brunswick Square. It was a happy circumstance, and animated Mr. Woodhouse for some time. Mr. Knightley had a cheerful manner, which always did him good, and his many inquiries after poor Isabella and her children were answered most satisfactorily. When this was over, Mr. Woodhouse gratefully observed, "It is very kind of you, Mr. Knightley, to come out at this late hour to call upon us. I am afraid you must have had a shocking walk." "Not at all, sir. It is a beautiful moonlit night, and so mild that I must draw back from your great fire." "But you must have found it very damp and dirty. I wish you may not catch cold." "Oh, dirty, sir. Look at my shoes. Not a speck on them." "Well, that is quite surprising, for we have had a vast deal of rain here. It rained dreadfully hard for half an hour while we were at breakfast. I wanted them to put off the wedding." "By the by, I have not wished you joy. Being pretty well aware of what sort of joy you must both be feeling, I have been in no hurry with my congratulations, but I hope it all went off tolerably well. How did you all behave? Who cried most?" "Ah, poor Miss Taylor. 'Tis a sad business." "Poor Mr. and Miss Woodhouse, if you please. But I cannot possibly say poor Miss Taylor. I have a great regard for you and Emma, but when it comes to the question of dependence or independence, at any rate, it must be better to have only one to please than two." "Especially when one of those two is such a fanciful, troublesome creature," said Emma playfully. "That is what you have in your head, I know, and what you would certainly say if my father were not by." "I believe it is very true, my dear, indeed," said Mr. Woodhouse with a sigh. "I am afraid I am sometimes very fanciful and troublesome." "My dearest papa, you do not think I could mean you, or suppose Mr. Knightley to mean you? What a horrible idea. Oh, no, I meant only myself. Mr. Knightley loves to find fault in me, you know. In a joke. It is all a joke. We always say what we like to one another." Mr. Knightley, in fact, was one of the few people who could see faults in Emma Woodhouse, and the only one who had ever told her of them. And though this was not particularly agreeable to Emma herself, she knew it would be so much less so to her father, that she would not have him really suspect such a circumstance as her not being thought perfect by everybody. "Emma knows I never flatter her," said Mr. Knightley, "but I meant no reflection on anybody. Miss Taylor has been used to having 2 persons to please. She will now have but 1. The chances are that she must be a gainer." "Well," said Emma, willing to let it pass, "you want to hear about the wedding, and I shall be happy to tell you, for we all behaved charmingly. Everybody was punctual, everybody in their best looks, not a tear, and hardly a long face to be seen. Except for Pepper, who wasn't fed before I started.
Oh.
You'll live. Oh, no. We all felt that we were going to be only half a mile apart and were sure of meeting every day. Dear Emma bears everything so well, said her father. But, Mr. Knightley, she is really very sorry to lose poor Miss Taylor, and I am sure she will miss her more than she thinks for. Emma turned away her head, divided between tears and smiles. It is impossible that Emma should not miss such a companion, said Mr. Knightley. We should not like her so well as we do, sir, if we could suppose it. And she knows how much the marriage is to Miss Taylor's advantage. She knows how very acceptable it is to be at Miss Taylor's time of life. Oh, it must be at Miss Taylor's time of life to be settled in a home of her own, and how important to her to be secure of a comfortable provision, and therefore cannot allow herself to feel so much pain as pleasure. Every friend of Miss Taylor must be glad to have her so happily married. And you have forgotten one matter of joy to me, said Emma, and a very considerable one, that I made the match myself. I made the match, 4 years ago, and to have it take place and be proved in the right, when so many people said Mr. Weston would never marry again, may comfort me for anything. Mr. Knightley shook his head at her. Her father fondly replied, Ah, my dear, I wish you would not make matches and foretell things, for whatever you say always comes to pass. Pray, do not make any more matches. I promise you to make none for myself, Papa, but I must indeed for other people. It is the greatest amusement in the world. And after such success, everybody said that Mr. Weston would never marry again. Oh, dear, no. Mr. Weston, who had been a widower so long, and who seemed so perfectly comfortable without a wife, so constantly occupied either in his business in town or among his friends here, always acceptable wherever he went, always cheerful. Mr. Weston did not need spend a single evening in the year alone if he did not like it. Oh, no. Mr. Weston certainly would never marry again. Some people even talked of a promise to his wife on her deathbed, and others of the son and uncle not letting him. All manners of solemn nonsense was talked on the subject, and I believed none of it. Ever since the day, about 4 years ago, that Miss Taylor and I met with him in the Broadway lane when, because it began to mizzle, he darted away with so much gallantry and borrowed 2 umbrellas for us from Farmer Mitchell's, I made up my mind on the subject. I planned the match from that hour, and when such success has blessed me in this instance, dear Papa, you cannot think I shall leave off matchmaking. We were just talking the other day about having a lot of different words for rain in Seattle. Like, it's just misting, it's drizzling, but mizzling. Is that halfway between misting and drizzling?
Apparently. I like it.
Nice weather for ducks. Yes. I do not understand what you mean by success, said Mr. Knightley. Success supposes endeavor. Your time has been properly and delicately spent, if you have been endeavoring for the last 4 years to bring about this marriage. A worthy employment for a young lady's mind. But if, which I rather imagine, your making the match, as you call it, means only your planning it, you're saying to yourself one idle day, I think it would be a very good thing for Miss Taylor if Mr. Weston were to marry her, and saying it again to yourself every now and then afterwards. Why do you talk of success? Where is your merit? What are you proud of? You made a lucky guess, and that is all that can be said. Harsh but fair.
Yes.
Hi, Pepper. I know, I'm sorry. I meant to feed you before we started.
It's also hard not to take his side when he's the only one who ever criticizes Emma.
Right. I'm showing everyone the illustration of Mr. Weston bringing two umbrellas to the ladies while it's mizzling.
Such gallantry.
Such a charming illustration. I gotta say, I can't remember the actor's name off the top of my head, but the Mr. Weston in the new Emma he's great. I loved him. He's really delightful. He's Lestrade in the BBC Sherlock.
Oh,
whatever his name is.
Yeah, he's been in a ton of BBC stuff.
He's a great Mr. Weston. Where was I? And have you never known the pleasure and triumph of a lucky guess? I pity you. I thought you cleverer, for depend upon it, a lucky guess is never merely luck. There is always some talent in it. And as to my poor word success, which you quarrel with, I do not know that I am so entirely without any claim to it. You have drawn 2 pretty pictures, but I think there may be a third, a something between the do-nothing and the do-all. If I had not promoted Mr. Weston's visit here, and given so many little encouragements, and smoothed many little matters, it might not have come to anything after all. I think you must know Hartfield enough to comprehend that. A straightforward, open-hearted man like Weston, and a rational, unaffected woman like Miss Taylor, may be safely left to manage their own concerns. You are more likely to have done harm to yourself than good to them by interference. Emma never thinks of herself if she can do good to others, rejoined Mr. Woodhouse, understanding but in part. But, my dear, pray do not make any more matches. They are silly things and break up one's family circle grievously. Only one more, Papa, only for Mr. Elton. Poor Mr. Elton. You like Mr. Elton, Papa. I must look about for a wife for him. There is nobody in Highbury who deserves him, and he has been here a whole year, and has fitted up his house so comfortably that it would be a shame to have him single any longer. And I thought when he was joining their hands today, he looked so very much as if he would like to have the same kind of office done for him. The same kind of office done for him. I think very well of Mr. Elton, and it is the only way I have of doing him a service. Mr. Elton is a very... Sometimes it's hard to tell who's talking. Mr. Elton is a very pretty young man, to be sure, and a very good young man, and I have a great regard for him. But if you want to show him any attention, my dear, ask him to come and dine with us some day. That will be a much better thing. I dare say Mr. Knightley will be so kind as to meet him. With a great deal of pleasure, sir, at any time, said Mr. Knightley, laughing. And I agree with you entirely that it will be a much better thing. Invite him to dinner, Emma, and help him to the best of the fish and the chicken, but leave him to choose his own wife. Depend upon it, a man of 6 or 7 and 20 can take care of himself. Was it like inappropriate to say someone's name exactly, someone's age exactly? We have Mr. Knightley is 7 or 8 and 30, and apparently Mr. Elton is 6 or 7 and 20.
Yeah. I don't know.
Maybe that was the equivalent of saying someone in their mid-20s or like late 30s or something. You just said, you picked 2 years that were plausible and said those. Much longer. All right. We shall move on to chapter 2. Mr. Weston was a native of Highbury and born of a respectable family, which for the last 2 or 3 generations had been rising into gentility and property. He had received a good education, but on succeeding early in life to a small independence, had become indisposed for any of the more homely pursuits to which his brothers were engaged, and had satisfied an active, cheerful mind and social temper by entering into the militia of his county, then embodied. Captain Weston was a general favourite, and when the chances of his military life had introduced him to Miss Churchill of a great Yorkshire family, and Miss Churchill fell in love with him, nobody was surprised except her brother and his wife, who had never seen him, and who were full of pride and importance, which the connection would offend. Miss Churchill, however, being of age, and with the full command of her fortune, though her fortune bore no proportion to the family estate, was not to be dissuaded from the marriage, and it took place in the infinite mortification of Mr. and Mrs. Churchill, who threw her off with due decorum. It was an unsuitable connection, and did not produce much happiness. Mrs. Weston ought to have found more in it, for she had a husband whose warm heart and sweet temper made him think everything due to her in return for the great goodness of being in love with him. But though she had one sort of spirit, she had not the best. She had resolution enough to pursue her own will in spite of her brother, but not enough to refrain from unreasonable regrets at her brother's unreasonable anger, nor from missing the luxuries of her former home. They lived beyond their income, but still it was nothing in comparison to Enscombe. She did not cease to love her husband, but she wanted at once to be the wife of Captain Weston and Miss Churchill of Enscombe. Captain Weston, who had been considered, especially by the Churchills, as making such an amazing match, was proved to have much the worse of the bargain, for when his wife died after a 3 years' marriage, he was rather a poorer man than at first, and with a child to maintain. From the expense of the child, however, he was soon relieved. The boy had, with the additional softening claim of a lingering illness to his mother's, been the means of a sort of reconciliation, and Mr. and Mrs. Churchill, having no children of their own, nor any other young creature of equal kindred to care for, offered to take the whole charge of little Frank soon after her decease. Some scruples and some reluctance the widower father may be supposed to have felt, but as they were overcome by other considerations, the child was given up to the care and the wealth of the Churchills, and he had only his own comfort to seek, and his own situation to improve as he could. Boy, I forgot about the full nature of the backstory there.
Yeah.
Of course they don't give that entire backstory in the movie.
Yeah.
I don't remember. It's been so long since I watched the Gwyneth Paltrow one. I don't remember pretty much anything about it. But
I don't think that one really goes into the backstory.
Yeah. It does seem like an unnecessary amount of backstory, although it does help you understand the relationship between Frank Churchill and Mr. Weston.
Yes.
So
Yeah.
that explains a lot. I knew that he was sort of that Frank Churchill was sort of the heir to his uncle's and aunt's fortune.
Yeah.
And that was much greater than his father's. But I'd forgotten that about the whole reconciliation and that he had been with them since he was basically born.
Yeah.
All right. So much backstory.
Jeez.
A complete change of life became desirable. He quitted the militia and engaged in trade, having brothers already established in a good way in London, which afforded him a favorable opening. It was a concern which brought just employment enough. He had still a small house in Highbury, where most of his leisure days were spent, and between useful occupation and the pleasures of society, the next 18 or 20 years of his life passed cheerfully away. He had, by that time, realized an easy competence, enough to secure the purchase of a little estate adjoining Highbury, which he had always longed for, enough to marry a woman as portionless even as Miss Taylor, and to live according to the wishes of his own friendly and social disposition. It was now some time since Miss Taylor had begun to influence his schemes, but as it was not the tyrannic influence of youth on youth, it had not shaken his determination of never settling till he could purchase Randalls, and the sale of Randalls was long looked forward to, that he had gone steadily on, with these objects in view, till they were accomplished. He had made his fortune, bought his house, and obtained his wife, and was beginning a new period of existence with every probability of greater happiness than in any yet passed through. He had never been an unhappy man. His own temper had secured him from that, even in his first marriage, but his second must show him how delightful a well-judging and truly amiable woman could be, and must give him the pleasantest proof of its being a great deal better to choose than to be chosen, to excite gratitude than to feel it. He had only himself to please in this choice. His fortune was his own, for as to Frank, it was more than being tacitly brought up as his uncle's heir. It had become so avowed an adoption as to have him assume the name of Churchill on coming of age. It was most unlikely, therefore, that he should ever want his father's assistance. His father had no apprehension of it. The aunt was a capricious woman and governed her husband entirely, but it was not in Mr. Weston's nature to imagine that any caprice could be strong enough to affect one so dear, and, as he believed, so deservedly dear. He saw his son every year in London, and was proud of him, and his fond report of him as a very fine young man had made Highbury feel a sort of pride in him too. He was looked on as sufficiently belonging to the place to make his merits and prospects a kind of common concern. Oh, got like a weird lighting situation going on here because the clouds. That's fine. You can still see my face, right, YouTube?
Yes.
Mr. Frank Churchill was one of the boasts of Highbury, and a lively curiosity to see him prevailed, though the compliment was so little returned that he had never been there in his life. His coming to visit his father had been often talked of, but never achieved. Rude. Now, upon his father's marriage, it was very generally proposed, as a most proper attention, that the visit should take place. There was not a dissentient voice on the subject, either when Mrs. Perry drank tea with Mrs. and Miss Bates, or when Mrs. and Miss Bates returned the visit. Now was the time for Mr. Frank Churchill to come among them, and the hope strengthened when it was understood that he had written to his new mother on the occasion. For a few days every morning visit in Highbury included some mention of the handsome letter Mrs. Weston had received. I suppose you have heard of the handsome letter Mr. Frank Churchill has written to Mrs. Weston? I understand it was a very handsome letter indeed. Mr. Woodhouse told me of it. Mr. Woodhouse saw the letter, and he said he never saw such a handsome letter in his life. What makes a letter handsome, I ask of you, aside from having a very even hand, I suppose?
Yes.
It was indeed a highly prized letter. Mrs. Weston had, of course, formed a very favorable idea of the young man, and such a pleasing attention was an irresistible proof of his great good sense, and a most welcome addition to every source and every expression of congratulation which her marriage had already secured. She felt herself a most fortunate woman, and she had lived long enough to know how fortunate she might well be thought, where the only regret was for a partial separation from friends, whose friendship for her had never cooled, and who could ill bear to part with her. She knew that at times she must be missed, and could not think without pain of Emma's losing a single pleasure or suffering an hour's ennui from the want of her companionableness. But dear Emma was no feeble character. She was more equal to her situation than most girls would have been, and had sense and energy and spirits that might be hoped would bear her well and happily through its little difficulties and privations. And then there was such comfort in the very easy distance of Randalls from Hartfield, so convenient for even solitary female walking. Even female walking, imagine that. And in Mr. Weston's disposition and circumstances, which would make the approaching season no hindrance to their spending half the evenings in a week together. Her situation was altogether the subject of hours of gratitude to Mrs. Weston, and of moments only of regret. And her satisfaction, her more than satisfaction, her cheerful enjoyment was so just and so apparent that Emma, well as she knew her father, was sometimes taken by surprise at his being still able to pity poor Miss Taylor when they left her at Randalls in the centre of every domestic comfort, or saw her go away in the evening attended by her pleasant husband to a carriage of her own. But never did she go without Mr. Woodhouse's giving a gentle sigh and saying, "Oh, poor Miss Taylor, she would be very glad to stay." There was no recovering Miss Taylor, nor much likelihood of ceasing to pity her, but a few weeks brought some alleviation to Mr. Woodhouse. The compliments of his neighbours were over. He was no longer teased by wishing joy of so sorrowful an event, and the wedding cake, which had been a great distress to him, was all ate up. His own stomach could bear nothing rich, and he could never believe other people to be different from himself. What was unwholesome to him he regarded as unfit for anybody, and he had, therefore, earnestly tried to dissuade them from having any wedding cake at all. And when that proved vain, as earnestly tried to prevent anybody's eating it. He had been on the pains of consulting Mr. Perry, the apothecary, on the subject. Mr. Perry was an intelligent, gentlemanlike man, whose frequent visits were one of the comforts of Mr. Woodhouse's life, and, upon being applied to, he could not but acknowledge, though it seemed rather against the bias of inclination, that wedding cake might certainly disagree with many, perhaps with most people, unless taken moderately. With such an opinion, in confirmation of his own, Mr. Woodhouse hoped to influence every visitor of the new married pair. But still the cake was eaten, and there was no rest for his benevolent nerves till it was all gone. There was a strange rumor in Highbury of all the little Perrys being seen with a slice of Mrs. Weston's birthday cake in their hands, but Mr. Woodhouse would never believe it. For some reason, we have decided this is a necessary illustration. All the little Perrys apparently eating wedding cake. I really should look up one of these days what the actual specific tradition of English wedding cake was. I don't know if it's.
Oh yeah,
because I know it. Well, I know it's more like a fruit cake or something.
Probably.
And you would like mail a piece to people who couldn't make it to the wedding.
That's true.
And this really sounds like it's like people are visiting them after the wedding and then getting a piece of cake.
Yeah.
So maybe people didn't have receptions.
Yeah.
Because you got married in a church and then you left, right?
Yeah.
So I guess the reception was more like people would come to visit and you would give them a piece of cake, which would make sense to have something like fruit cake, which keeps longer.
Yeah.
That's my understanding, but I really, this is just making me realize I should look that up one of these days.
That's true. I never thought about that.
Yeah, because I feel like I've seen like period TV shows set as recently as like maybe the 30s where people were still like mailing someone a slice of wedding cake. So
yeah, and it makes more sense how Emma's talking about they should pay their wedding visit to them or something.
Yes, yeah.
Like that makes more sense as a thing that you do in lieu of having a reception.
Yeah, it actually makes, it just makes a lot more sense, you know.
Yeah.
People needed more things to do then. So you had the wedding, that was one event.
Yeah.
And then all the little receptions, receiving someone into your house.
Yeah.
Bet you that's where the term reception came from.
Yeah. Yeah, that does make a lot more, also seems like a lot less, well, I guess it depends on how many people you receive, but it seems like less work on the bride and groom because typically at a reception you have to stand there and like greet everybody and or at least walk around and.
Although nobody is saying that a big ass party isn't great.
It's true.
Although, have you ever been to an American wedding? Where's vodka? Where's marinated herring? You're probably not familiar with that song.
No, I'm not.
It's a Go-Go Bordello song. Where are the musicians that got the taste? Where's the food that's going to last 3 days?
Nice.
I need to go to some Go-Go Bordello style weddings. Anyway.
That sounds like an Italian wedding.
Chapter 3. Let us continue on. Let's see. I forgot to look at the time exactly when we started.
Oh.
Hold on. Let me see. It was about 6. Let's say it was about 6:20. Okay.
Yeah.
So I was just kind of keeping track of how much time we have on the
right. Yeah.
on the Instagram.
It was definitely not earlier than 6:20.
Teresa knows what I'm talking about. Okay. Chapter 3. Mr. Woodhouse was fond of society in his own way. He liked very much to have his friends come and see him, and from various united causes, from his long residence at Hartfield, and his good nature, from his fortune, his house, and his daughter, he could command the visits of his own little circle, in a great measure as he liked. He had not much intercourse with any families beyond that circle. His horror of late hours and large dinner parties made him unfit for any acquaintance, but such as would visit him on his own terms. Fortunately for him, Highbury, including Randalls in the same parish, and Donwell Abbey in the parish adjoining, the seat of Mr. Knightley, comprehended many such. Not unfrequently, through Emma's persuasion, he had some of the chosen and the best to dine with him, but evening parties were what he preferred, and unless he fancied himself at any time unequal to company, there was scarcely an evening in the week in which Emma could not make up a card table for him. Real long-standing regard brought the Westons and Mr. Knightley. And by Mr. Elton, a young man living alone without liking it, the privilege of exchanging any vacant evening of his own blank solitude for the elegancies and society of Mr. Woodhouse's drawing room, and the smiles of his lovely daughter, was in no danger of being thrown away. After these came a second set. Among the most commutable? Is that a typo for comfortable, or is that a word I'm not familiar with?
I don't know.
Could go either way. I just realized that I only have about 15 minutes left, and I was going to try and keep this at an hour. So I might not be able to finish chapter 3, but we might just find a good ending point in the middle of chapter 3. It's fine. Among the most commutable of whom were Mrs. and Miss Bates, and Mrs. Goddard, 3 ladies almost always at the service of an invitation from Hartfield, and who were fetched and carried home so often that Mr. Woodhouse thought it no hardship for either James or the horses. Had it taken place only once a year, it would have been a grievance. Mrs. Bates, the widow of a former vicar of Highbury, was a very old lady, almost past everything but tea and quadrille. She lived with her single daughter in a very small way, and was considered with all the regard and respect which a harmless old lady, under such untoward circumstances, can excite. Her daughter enjoyed a most uncommon privilege of popularity for a woman neither young, handsome, rich, nor those who might hate her into outward respect. She had never boasted neither beauty nor cleverness. Her youth had passed without distinction, and her middle of life was devoted to the care of a failing mother, and the endeavor to make a small income go as far as possible. And yet she was a happy woman, and a woman whom no one named without goodwill. It was her own universal goodwill and contented temper which worked such wonders. She loved everybody, was interested in everybody's happiness, quick-sighted to everybody's merits, thought herself a most fortunate creature, and surrounded with blessings and such an excellent mother, and so many good neighbors and friends, and a home that wanted for nothing. The simplicity and cheerfulness of her nature, her contented and grateful spirit, were a recommendation to everybody, and a mine of felicity to herself. She was a great talker upon little matters, which exactly suited Mr. Woodhouse, full of trivial communications and harmless gossip. Mrs. Goddard was the mistress of a school, not of a seminary, or an establishment, or anything which professed, in long sentences of refined nonsense, to combine liberal acquirements with elegant morality, upon new principles and new systems, and where young ladies, for enormous pay, might be screwed out of health and into vanity.
Wow.
I guess the phrase screwed out of meant something different then, and I don't know exactly what it means. I don't think it means that she was screwing people.
Quite the same.
Screwing people out of their health and right into vanity. Okay, fun. English is fun. Linguistics is a good time.
That sounds similar, though.
But a real, honest, old-fashioned boarding school. There a reasonable quantity of accomplishments were sold at a reasonable price, and where girls might be sent to be out of the way and scramble themselves into a little education without any danger of coming back prodigies. Mrs. Goddard's school was in high repute, and very deservedly, for Highbury was reckoned in a particularly healthy spot. She had an ample house and garden, gave the children plenty of wholesome food, let them run about a great deal in summer, and in winter dressed their chilblains with her own hands. I'm probably mispronouncing that word. It's one I've only ever read. Chilblains?
I've only ever read it too.
I don't know. It was no wonder that a train of 20 young couple were now walked after her to church. She was a plain, motherly kind of woman who had worked hard in her youth, and now thought herself entitled to the occasional holiday of a tea visit, and having formerly owed much to Mr. Woodhouse's kindness, felt his particular claim on her to leave her neat parlour hung round with fancy work whenever she could, and to win or lose a few sixpences by his fireside. These were the ladies whom Emma found herself very frequently able to collect, and happy was she, for her father's sake, in the power, though as far as she was herself concerned, there was no remedy for the absence of Mrs. Weston. She was delighted to see her father look comfortable, and very much pleased with herself for contriving things so well. But the quiet prosings of 3 such women made her feel that every evening so spent was indeed one of the long evenings she had fearfully anticipated. As she sat one morning, looking forward to exactly such a close of the present day, a note was brought from Mrs. Goddard, requesting, in most respectful terms, to be allowed to bring Miss Smith with her. A most welcome request, for Miss Smith was a girl of 17, whom Emma knew very well by sight, and had long felt an interest in, on account of her beauty. A very gracious invitation was returned, and the evening no longer dreaded by the fair mistress of the mansion. I forgot that Miss Smith is supposed to be several years younger than Emma.
Yeah.
I feel like they definitely depict them as being of an age in the recent movie. I can't remember.
Well, 17 and 20, I mean, it's not that far apart, although she's definitely younger.
I guess 17 and 20 are pretty different today, but maybe not as much back then.
Yeah. That's...
If you're unmarried, 17 and 20 is about what's the difference really? The difference between Kitty and Lizzie. Anyway.
Yeah.
Anyway.
Whatever. Anyway.
I've completely lost my place again. As she sat one morning, looking forward to exactly such a close of the present day, a note was brought from Mrs. Goddard. I already read that part. To bring Miss Smith with her. No longer dreaded by the fair mistress of the mansion. Harriet Smith was the natural daughter of somebody. Somebody had placed her, several years back, at Mrs. Goddard's school, and somebody had lately raised her from the condition of scholar to that of parlour boarder. This was all that was generally known of her history. She had no visible friends but what had been acquired at Highbury, and was now just returned from a long visit in the country to some young ladies who had been at school there with her. She was a very pretty girl, and her beauty happened to be of a sort which Emma particularly admired. She was short, plump, and fair, with a fine bloom, blue eyes, light hair, regular features, and a look of great sweetness. And before the end of the evening, Emma was as much pleased with her manners as her person, and quite determined to continue the acquaintance. I love her being described as being very pretty and also plump. That makes me happy. She was not struck by anything remarkably clever in Miss Smith's conversation, but she found her altogether very engaging, not inconveniently shy, not unwilling to talk, and yet so far from pushing, showing so proper and becoming a deference, seeming so pleasantly grateful for being admitted to Hartfield, and so artfully impressed by the appearance of everything in so superior a style to what she had been used to, that she must have good sense, and deserve encouragement. Encouragement should be given. Those soft blue eyes and all those natural graces should not be wasted on the inferior society of Highbury and its connections. The acquaintance she had already formed were unworthy of her. The friends from whom she had just parted, though very good sort of people, must be doing her harm. They were a family of the name of Martin, whom Emma well knew by character, as renting a large farm of Mr. Knightley, and residing in the parish of Donwell. Very creditably, she believed. She knew Mr. Knightley thought highly of them, but they must be coarse and unpolished, and very unfit to be the intimates of a girl who wanted only a little more knowledge and elegance to be quite perfect. She would notice her. She would improve her. She would detach her from her bad acquaintance, and introduce her into good society. She would form her opinions and her manners. It would be an interesting and certainly a very kind undertaking, highly becoming her own situation in life, her leisure and powers. I wish I knew exactly when we had started.
Oh, it's not giving you the...
Well, it doesn't give you the warning until 1 minute, I think, on Instagram, which is not super useful.
Yeah.
If I want to decide where to end.
Yeah.
All right, I will read one more paragraph. I think I should be safe. She was so busy in admiring those soft blue eyes, in talking and listening, and forming all those schemes in the in-betweens. And the evening flew away at a very unusual rate, and the supper table, which always closed such parties, and for which she had been used to sit and watch the due time, was all set out and ready, and moved towards the fire before she was aware, with an alacrity beyond the common impulse of a spirit which yet was never indifferent to the credit of doing everything well and attentively, with the real goodwill of a mind delighted with its own ideas, did she then do all the honors of the meal, and help and recommend the minced chicken and scalloped oysters, with an urgency which she knew would be acceptable to the early hours and civil scruples of their guests. Upon such occasions, poor Mr. Woodhouse's feelings were in sad warfare. He loved to have the cloth laid, because it had been the fashion of his youth, but his conviction of suppers being very unwholesome made him rather sorry to see anything put on it. And while his hospitality would have welcomed his visitors to everything, his care for their health made him grieve that they would eat. Such another small basin of thin gruel as his own was all that he could eat. All that he could, with thorough self-approbation, recommend, though he might constrain himself while the ladies were comfortably clearing the nicer things to say, "Mrs. Bates, let me propose your venturing on one of these eggs. An egg boiled very soft is not unwholesome. Searle understands boiling an egg better than anybody. I would not recommend an egg boiled by anybody else, but you need not be afraid. They are very small, you see. One of our small eggs will not hurt you. Miss Bates, let Emma help you to a little bit of tart, a very, very little bit. Ours are all apple tarts. You need not be afraid of unwholesome preserves here. I do not advise the custard. Mrs. Godwin, what do you say to half a glass of wine? A small half glass, put into a tumbler of water? I do not think it would disagree with you." Emma allowed her father to talk, but supplied her visitors in a much more satisfactory style, and on the present evening had particular pleasure in sending them away happy. The happiness of Miss Smith was quite equal to her intentions. Miss Woodhouse was so great a personage in Highbury that the prospect of the introduction had given as much panic as pleasure. But the humble, grateful little girl went off with highly gratified feelings, delighted with the affability with which Miss Woodhouse had treated her all the evening, and actually shaken hands with her at last. Perfect. That is the end of chapter 3. Yay. Excellent timing. Good job. So we will begin chapter 4, Harriet Smith's Intimacy at Hartfield, tomorrow, around 6, unless any delays. But 6:15ish. You know how it goes. I will be both on. Oh, hi, Nee. I didn't see that you had joined the Instagram. I will be both on Instagram and YouTube. Please let me know if you have any suggestions about how I can better set this up, especially if you watch the YouTube, since this is a new portion. I've just been doing it on the Instagram previous to this. So let me know if you have any feedback of any kind. Lighting could have been a little bit better today, but I can't be held responsible for clouds. With that, on that note, I suppose that I shall leave you all. I hope, as my friend Strangely often says, that you're all in a safe place and at a comfortable temperature, and that you have a lovely evening, and that I will see you tomorrow. End stream. And then Instagram.